In 2003, the United States entered Iraq. Using tactics that had previously worked against traditional enemies, it found itself in a bitter fight that left the top brass in the military confounded. Against a smaller, less sophisticated, and under-resourced enemy, they were losing. As the head of the Joint Special Operations Task Force, General Stanley McChrystal knew he would need to transform his massive and highly efficient military machine into something completely different. Something that looked a lot more like the enemy they were facing, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI. But this isn't a war story. This is a story about organizational transformation to meet the demands of the day. As I'm recording this summary, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, which is forcing every single organization on the planet to rethink how work gets done all at the same time. It's a time where silos need to be torn down, helping you find best practices from all corners of your company and making sure you can continuously adapt at scale. The solution is to build teams of teams. If you need a proof point about whether or not this works before you listen on, well, here it is. One of the key measures of effectiveness in the war was the number of raids they would run each month. When McChrystal got there, they were running 10. By trying to squeeze every last ounce of efficiency and effectiveness out of their resources using the old method, they were able to increase that number to 18, an impressive increase. But when they transformed into a team of teams, they were able to increase that number to 300. They were running 17 times faster with no decrease in effectiveness. In an environment where speed and adaptability is a key to your success, that's the kind of transformation that's required. Let's get started. Part 1. The Proteus problem. In 2004, the world's most elite counter-terrorist force is struggling against what appears to be a ragtag band of radicals. What McChrystal and his team realized was that their biggest challenges were not with the sophistication and the size of the enemy, but in the new environment they were operating in. The landscape has shifted. AQI had an unorthodox structure that allowed it to become more connected, faster, and less predictable than any other enemy the United States had ever faced. The military loves abbreviations and called the defining element that holds you back in a situation a limfac, a limiting factor. McChrystal quickly realized that the limfac in this situation wasn't tactics or technology, but in the task force organizational DNA. Only a complete cultural and organizational structural overhaul would do. Or, to put it more simply, it was about the mundane art of management. Efficiency is no longer enough. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, most industries, including the military, subscribed to management techniques that had their roots in Frederick Taylor's scientific management. The systems spawned from it were excellent at achieving efficient execution of known, repeatable processes at scale. For instance, if you need to produce 1 million of something and already know exactly how to do it, scientific management is a great way to go about it. During the 20th century, this approach was incredibly successful. But as we move into an era where the pace of change increases with every single day, a cliche, I know, but also true, we are moving into territory where a new approach is needed. From complicated to complex. The technology we've developed over the past few decades allow us to track almost anything and everything with greater and greater amounts of precision. At first blush, you'd think that this would create even more predictability in a complicated world, and thus more efficiency. However, the opposite has actually occurred. The world is now less predictable because of the advance of technology, not in spite of it. Here, it's helpful to understand the difference between complicated and complex. Complicated things, like machines, have a lot of parts that are joined to each other in relatively simple ways. For instance, an internal combustion engine might be confusing to most people, but it can ultimately be understood as a series of relationships that can be quantified and understood. You can understand what happens when you alter or activate one part of the engine. Complex things, like living organisms, ecosystems, and national economies, have an enormous and diverse collection of connected elements that interact frequently. Because of how densely those things are connected, systems like these fluctuate in extreme ways and are highly unpredictable. Doing the right thing. What McChrystal quickly realized was that what was previously a complicated situation was now a complex one, and so predicting in advance what the enemy might do and trying to maximize efficiency was a strategy doomed to fail. The only way to deal with a rapidly evolving situation is to become more adaptable, which is exactly what the task force did next. Part 2. From many, one. The only way you can create an organization that's able to respond in real time to an always changing situation is to build, you guessed it, a team of teams. From command to team. The first thing that needed to change in the task force was the long-standing military practice of commanding from the top down. In its place would need to be a front line that was able to respond to dynamic, real-time developments with an improvised and coordinated response. This requires two things: trust and common purpose. In a command structure, you don't really need to trust your teammates because everybody is just doing what they're told to do by somebody higher up on the food chain. However, when decisions need to be made on the fly, trusting the people around you becomes critical to getting anything done. Without it, teams disintegrate into chaos. This is one of the main purposes of BUDS, the training that includes the infamous Hell Week that Navy SEALs need to make it through in order to graduate. The purpose of the training isn't to make super soldiers, it's to make super teams. Almost all training tasks are done in teams, all the way down to walking together to the dining hall. What they're being trained to do is to trust and rely upon each other. Team of teams. It's easy to understand how you could build trust in small teams. It happens over time as the individuals on the team get to know one another. That's easy with a group of 25, difficult with any group larger than 100, and impossible with a group of 7,000, the size of the task force McChrystal was leading. Most of the traits that make teams so powerful also made it very difficult to scale them across the entire organization. The solution they came up with was to create a team of teams, an organization where the relationships between teams resembled the relationships between individuals on a single team. To accomplish this, they didn't need every member of the task force to know everybody else, which was impossible. They just needed everyone to know someone on every team. This meant that when they had to work with another team, they could envision a friendly face instead of a rival. How exactly did they do that? That's what we'll dive into next. Part 3. Shared consciousness. What McChrystal did next was to create what he calls a shared consciousness. Seeing the system. The first thing the task force needed to do was to upend the need-to-know fallacy. The problem with this approach is that it depends on the assumption that somebody, either a person or an algorithm, understands who does and doesn't need to know which material. In a fast-moving environment, this is an impossibility. In order to function effectively, every team needs to have a holistic understanding of the interaction between all of the moving parts. In other words, everyone needs to see the system in its entirety in order for a team of teams approach to work. Brains out of the footlockers. The critical piece to the transformation McChrystal envisioned for the task force was their Operations and Intelligence Brief, the O&I. It's a standard military practice where a regular meeting is held by the leadership to integrate everything it is doing and knows. The traditional way of running this meeting was to get prepared reports from junior personnel with no time given for questions and discussion. Whether or not the update was understood by everybody was besides the point. The way McChrystal ran it was to turn that idea on its head. The majority of time would be spent on open-ended conversation between the briefer and the leadership. Not only that, but they invited members from all branches of the military to attend, turning it from a relatively small affair into a session attended by thousands, yes, thousands of people, 6 days a week without fail. Running it this way created new insights and allowed the group to understand complex issues in deeper ways. The most important outcome was that it allowed all members of the organization to see problems being solved in real time and understand the perspective of the senior leadership team. That allowed them to learn, over time, to trust their own judgment in situations that arose outside the meeting and make critical decisions in real time. From this comes a strong sense of purpose shared by everybody in the organization. Share information everywhere. Going back to the idea of creating the same level of trust between teams that exists within teams, McChrystal started using embedding and liaison programs to create strong ties. An example of embedding would be requiring an Army Special Forces operator to become embedded in a SEAL team and vice versa. At first, neither team would welcome the intrusion, but over time they began to understand each other better and even start to adopt the better qualities of each other's culture. An example of a liaison would be sending an ambassador-like figure between organizations, like the task force and the CIA, for instance. This practice wasn't new, but how McChrystal approached it was. The accepted practice for a liaison program would be to assign to these roles people who were about to retire or who were being put out to pasture. Instead, McChrystal started sending some of his best people in these roles. Eventually, the partner organizations returned the favor, and ties between all of the stakeholders in the war were being strengthened, and everybody was working together towards a common goal, fighting the enemy instead of protecting their own turf. Part 4. Letting go. Empowered execution. All of this work is meaningless unless you actually start letting important decisions be made on the front lines, which is exactly what McChrystal and the task force started doing. Hands off. It was a regular occurrence for McChrystal to be woken up in the middle of the night in order to make a final call on a mission. While it made him feel important and needed, he quickly started to question his value in the process. He would usually trust the recommendations of his team, meaning his involvement was basically a rubber stamp, only serving to slow down the process. Eventually, the task force concluded that putting the decision-making power into the hands of the front lines would create a situation where a 70% solution executed today would be better than a 90% solution executed tomorrow. They might not always make the right decision, but it was a trade-off they were willing to make in the effort to create a fast-moving, agile organization. The assumption, of course, was that leaders possess superior wisdom and decision-making ability. However, what they found was the exact opposite. They were getting a 90% solution today instead of a 70% solution tomorrow. That's because instead of bringing recommendations to their leaders for approval, they were now the ones making the final call and were more invested in the outcome. It's also because the leadership could never understand what was happening on the ground as well as the people who were there. What you end up with is a team armed with insights from across a network, able to decide and act decisively in moments where speed is of the essence. It's the combination of what McChrystal calls shared consciousness and empowered execution. Leading like a gardener. Just like a complex situation requires a new culture and norms, it also requires a different leadership metaphor. Under a command structure, a leader is like a chess master, maneuvering pieces around a board trying to outwit their opponent. Under a decentralized structure, a leader is like a gardener, focused on shaping an ecosystem. While gardeners plant and harvest, they spend most of their time tending to the garden as it grows. They water plants, make sure the beds are fertilized, and that weeds are removed. They spend long days doing these things, and they're not simply gestures. Their actions leave the crop stronger. Make sure you don't make the mistake that some leaders make in thinking that acting like a gardener is a passive process. To do this effectively, you need to adopt an eyes-on, hands-off approach, creating and maintaining the ecosystem. It requires constant attention and corrective action when you find things that need fixing. It requires you to make that fixing visible to the organization so it can mimic your behavior when they encounter it for themselves. The paradox is that the better you are as a gardener, the more you'll be tempted to become a chess master again. In order for this change to become permanent, you'll need to guard against it, especially when problems arise. So in conclusion, now more than ever, we need to adopt new mental models to make sense of the 21st century. Combining shared consciousness with empowered execution creates an adaptable organization that will be able to respond to any situation that it finds itself in. It's the only way forward from here.